We hear about it every day. We talk and think about it every day. But do we actually know what we mean when we talk about power? In this episode, we will find out. Hello, and welcome back for another podcast episode of Aceto Magazine. My name is Emil Schentürk, founder of Aceto Magazine and host of this show. Today, I'm going to talk about one of my favorite topics in all of political science, and it is the concept of power. It is not only one of my favorite topics to talk about because it is so central and so, omnipresent and kind of around everywhere, but because we have pretty much definitional unclarity about the term. Everyone uses this term in kind of different contexts and with different meaning. But this too is not that bad. In the end, I think we have a little bit of a misunderstanding of what power can do and how it affects our behavior, or whether it should affect our behavior in the first place. So I think this is not going to be the last episode or the last time I'm going to talk about this topic, because it is so complex and definitely nothing that we can just walk through in half an hour. But there are some structural points that I want to address when we talk about power. And the reason for that is, when recently browsing through the news and basically looking at the sources, I found that, it's very present in the media, that in Sudan we have renewed conflict between two parties there. And because I'm interested, obviously I dug deeper into it, just to find out that it's not that deep actually. So we do not have an ethnic or racial component to the conflict that is going on in Sudan. We do not have an ideology war there, or in, let's say, kind of an opinion-driven conflict that is going on in Sudan. We do not have, maybe to a certain extent, financial component there. I mean, these are all things that might play a minor role, but the main thing that has been going on there is that two men who basically ousted the government a couple of years ago together, now turning against each other. So they actually fought side by side when they overthrew the government a couple of years ago. And now kind of the other one, who actually was designated to be the deputy of the leading person there in this coup, wants to gain more power. And so the clashes erupted on Saturday between those two men, who became enemies over the last couple of months. There have been ongoing tensions. So it is a very different situation than from what we know in other wars, because some of them are more warranted than others. There are wars that have, because of territorial claims or ethnic claims, we can have a certain degree of understanding. Well, in this conflict, it is just about power, being more powerful than the next man. It is sad. It is very sad, because in the end, there's not much normative flesh to this whole thing. And this led me to kind of reflect on the concept of power. And not that I'm doing this the first time. As I said, it is one of the concepts that I put most thought into. And nonetheless, I want to start with some basic definitions of power and how it is treated in political science. So there is this very simplistic view, and this is not really a political science view, but more of a general understanding of power. And it entails that power means if you have the ability or the capacity to make others do what you want them to do. And this is basically the most fundamental way of understanding power, which is fine. It's not incorrect, so that's perfectly fine. But there's also an extension to it, and then it becomes, more into, or we kind of come closer to the direction of political science, saying that power is the ability or capacity to make others want what you want, basically, or make them want what your interest basically is. Which makes it a bit complex, because the component of making something to do, or someone to do something, is replaced by making them want to do certain things. And these things, not coincide, but represent the things that you want them to do. And to put this, and as you might have heard, it is kind of confusing if you want to put it into this words from a definitional perspective. So there are concepts that kind of divide power into different categories. So we have, first of all, the umbrella term of material or physical or hard power. So these are all basically describing the same thing. And it means that there are factors that influence people, or that you can use to influence people, that make them do things because they fear the consequence of something. Meaning that, for example, if you have a gun and force somebody to do a certain action, whatever it might be, this person is most likely going to do it if it's if the trade-off is not worth of dying. So there, the threat of the gun basically is the tool to exercise power over somebody else. In terms of nations, obviously this is the military capacity that every country has. So a stronger country can just threaten another country and say, well, if you do not this or that, we are going to attack you. Happens all the time, has happened before, is going to happen again, but this is not very sustainable, because once the threat is over, the country that was threatened is not going to continue this action, because if they would be convinced that this is a good action or course of action to follow, they would have done it in the first place. And because they didn't, it obviously is just dependent, their actions are only dependent on the presence of the threat. So once you stop investing into this hard power, into this military capacity, then obviously the power ends. Turning back to the individual example, if you hold the cashier the gun to his face and say, give me all the money, he's most likely going to do it. And if you just walk in without a gun and say, give me all the money, he says, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that, basically. Very simplistic account. Then the next one is financial power, the threat of financial means. So there actually, I don't have like a good example from the individual level, but we can think about nations right away. So one country is not behaving the way another country wants it to behave. They're saying, okay, we are going to sanction you, meaning that we're not going to trade with you, and we are going to convince others not to do the same. So economic threat. But you can also have economic incentives. That's a good one, because there you can also have an individual example. You can go to a certain person and say, well, I give you this amount of money, please run around and shout a certain slogan or whatever, make them to do or get them to do a certain action by the motivational factor of money. If it's a ridiculous action, you will need more money to make them do this. So power here is also kind of used in terms of money, and not only the financial threat, but also in terms of financial incentive. But here too, the problem is once the money, is not flowing, or is not threatening you, or the person that you want to influence, the person is not going to follow your path. So, basic problem as we have with the military or the physical or violent power in this case, that it is not an intrinsic motivation to do something. And then we turn to the a bit more complex definition of making somebody want to do something. It is the next umbrella term that is called soft power. And soft power is convincing people that your motives are the right ones. Basically, if you want to call it manipulation or propaganda, you can, because these terms are just euphemized versions of soft power. Or we can say that soft power might be a euphemized term of propaganda and manipulation, but this is a whole different discussion. I don't want to go into the details of the terminology here, but they basically describe all the same thing. Excursively, public diplomacy is the best sounding word for manipulation and propaganda, because public diplomacy means that you are applying those manipulative and soft power tactics to people outside of your country. Maybe a topic for another episode, but this is the best sounding version of it. So if we're just talking about the terminologies, we got that out of the way as well. But soft power means that you apply certain tactics in order to make others want what you want, but not really saying that this is in your interest. So people, if you convince somebody to do something and say it's a good idea to do this and this and that, if you convince somebody to hold a certain view on another person and kind of frame it in a way that makes this person accept that the other person is not that the other person is not a good one, hasn't a good character, for example, and at some point when you convince your friend to hold those views against another person, they will become convinced and carry on this thinking by themselves. So if we again then apply it to nations or on the macro level, it is basically when countries, for example, come together and convince other countries to have a certain view on. We can look at it. For example, the Gaddafi situation is very prominent in this regard. So Muammar al-Gaddafi, as you might know, was widely considered as a dictator and war criminal by Western countries, European and North American countries, but he was hailed as a hero by African countries. So where is the truth? The truth is something that we cannot assess in this talk here, but in terms of soft power, we can see that all those actors that were in between those two general views were tried to be influenced by other countries. And for example, in Europe, this was very prominent because France had a very negative stance towards Gaddafi, and they were very proactive in kind of spreading the idea that he was a bad person. And once they were able to kind of convince other European countries and also countries that lay outside of Europe, they still hold this view today, till today. So basically, through manipulation or convincing them, France achieved their own goal and legitimizing their invasion of Libya more than 10 years ago, I think, by convincing others to accept this behavior. And this happens quite often, and especially the United States is there an actor that is proactively trying to bring other countries down by talking them down and convincing other countries to go against their enemies. Iran is another prominent example of this policy, and today it's Russia. But on the other side, those countries as well have campaigns against the West, in all fairness, and the convincing act of going against the West is done also domestically, but also internationally with countries that they are allied with, and so on and so forth. But without going into too much detail, there are two streams: hard power, soft power. The disadvantage of hard power is that at one point it kind of vanishes, because once you do not uphold the military, or like the violent or the discursive means or the financial means to make others do certain actions, they will stop doing it. Whereas the soft power version of convincing and kind of applying your interest or making others adopt your interests is much more sustainable, because in the end they will carry on your agenda without knowing that they're carrying on your agenda. And at that point it becomes very dangerous. So these are the two basic forms of power. And in both cases, now we would say, well, soft power is much better than hard power. Okay, well, but the big disadvantage is, what if somebody is convincing someone to do such a thing that is so detrimental to society and to politics that we have just a sustained state of detrimental behavior? For example, if you convince other countries to hate another country, the situation will go on forever, because they will multiply it and also convince other countries and other actors to hate this certain country. So, and this might not be objectively true. It might not be that objectively true that that Muammar al-Gaddafi was a bad person. It might not be true that the United States of America are financial imperialists, and so on and so forth. So we hold those views and we convince others and influence them to do certain actions, but we don't know if they're objectively right or wrong, or whether we are just victims of a situation where others influenced us by soft power means. And if we want to apply this to the Sudan situation, we obviously see that there is no soft power actually in play, but there's just hard power, just the violent means of making the others bow down and kind of surrender. And this is a situation which is quite clear. So if they are in an open clash violently, one side will ultimately win and the other one will lose. And then the question arises, what happens next? And at this point, we come to the most interesting part of this episode. Until now, it was just explanatory and kind of, discussing the concept of power and what it entails and the mainstreams. But now we have reached the end of power. We have seen the forms of power, and we have seen that in Sudan, the basic goal is just to be more powerful than the next man. But what happens next? You can pause here and really, truly, and honestly think about what happens next when you successfully overpower somebody else. What happens next? I'm going to take you on a thought experiment, if you will. Let's say you are the president of a powerful nation, and then you start to conquer more land, and you conquer more land, and you conquer more land, and even more land. At some point, the whole world belongs to you. You've been more powerful than any other person on this planet. More money, more military means, hard power, and they all believe that what you do is right. So soft power as well. So you have the soft power element, over those people and each and every person on this planet. The question is, what happens next? You might go on other planets, conquer other planets, conquer whole solar systems, galaxies. And then what happens next? With each and every unit of power that you gain in an eternal power struggle, the next unit of power that you gain is going to have less value for you. It is something like owning money. The more money you have, the next unit of money, for example, the next lira you're going to earn is going to be less valuable than the lira that you earned before that. It is called the marginal diminishing returns. And the same holds also true for power. So the more power you have, the less important it is to you, because it is exhaustible. And this is what makes power weak. And unfortunately, nations are following this principle when designing state actions and policy making, and they're actually pursuing something that is weak. Because it is exhaustible, power becomes less valuable. And even worse, if we think of power in a whole different setting, namely, let's imagine you are the only person on this planet. What does power mean then? Do we still have power? If you're the only person living on this planet, do we have power then? Think about it. We do not have power. You can lift a certain weight from the ground, but you cannot assess this act without the presence of another person trying to do the same. Because if you lift up 100 kilos from the ground, you may be considered strong only if there's another person who can only lift 50 kilos. But you would be considered weak if there's another person who can lift 200 kilos. And this is very, very central when we think about political concepts. Try to put them into perspective, whether they need some other actors or if they're dependent on certain conditions. That would make them weak. If that is the case, a concept has structural weakness, is structurally not strong enough to lead your behavior and to inform your behavior. So if you, as the situation is in Sudan, are only concerned with gaining power, then you're an extremely weak person. Your thinking, your mind and your soul are so weak because the only thing that you think about and that drives your behavior is power. And this concept in turn is tied to certain conditions that are so fundamentally important for its existence that you as a person are not valuable in that case if your whole behavior is just designed to achieve power. So you need somebody else for power to be existent, and then you pursue something that needs this condition in order to destroy the other person, basically destroying the purpose and the ground of existence of power itself. And the more we think about that in this term, that power needs at least another actor, at least another person in this whole constellation, shows how cheap of a goal power and the achievement of power is. Actually, money is the same thing. Another topic, but money is the same thing. All these things that I just explained, I also explained in my book, DEVLET. So if you want to have a deep dive into this topic and read it in detail, order a copy, links are below. But just to kind of shortly summarize it, pursuing power is extremely cheap, and it shows that your character is not strong because you're making yourself dependent on a concept that in itself makes the existence of another person kind of central to his existence. So if power is dependent on that, you are basically dependent on other people, and dependency is never a sign of a strong and good character. So in this case of Sudan, we see that we have a big problem here, and then you would say and might think that what in the end is then a warranted intervention or conflict. For example, things that are normative. We can think about love, friendship. We can also think about culture and heritage. Well, now you might think, well, these are also concepts that need other people's existence to be existent themselves, right? That's true. And this is also what makes those motives also kind of weak, but because they are not solely tied to a person, or that they are not like the situation in Sudan where one person just wants to have power for the sake of having power, and the power is kind of shared, and the intervention and the war and conflict is for the purpose of the society. It is a bit above that, but in the end you're right, because the dependency is there. It is not that much of a warranted motive. But there is one thing, and now I just have to pull out this book again, because this is the main concept and central thinking of DEVLET and DEVLETism, the state system that I found and that I created with having these concepts in mind. What is something that does not need the existence of other concepts, people, and actors to survive and to just be there independently from everything else? What is it? Well, the answer is knowledge. Pursuing knowledge and coming closer to the full understanding of everything is the only thing that does not get more boring the more you know. We can even argue that it gets more interesting the more you know. But pursuing knowledge is inexhaustible. It will always remain interesting. It will always remain, worthy. It does not need people to exist, because knowledge itself, the truth, the objective truth, exists independently from our existence. So whether we are here or not, whether I'm talking on this podcast about the objective truth or not, whether you're listening to it or not, whether our ideas, wishes, and thoughts, whatever, exist or not, the objective truth will always remain the same. And everything that is done in the name of pursuing the objective truth, something that I call in DEVLETist terms the process of genuine knowledge production, is worthy and is warranted. And this is the thing and the only thing that should motivate state behavior. Interestingly, engaging in a genuine knowledge production might entail the use of power or powerful tactics. It might include at times the use of material power, hard power, and soft power. It also embraces the ideas of peace and prosperity, material wealth. But these are just prerequisites of or making the environment for genuine knowledge production more suitable. But in the end, this is the only goal and the only worthy driver of state behavior, but also individual behavior. Think about your lives. Think about yourself. Think about what power has gotten you, and where did people with a lot of power go from that point on? What did they do? What was the next thing that they did? This is not a fulfilling matter. and basing your behavior on the concept of power just for the sake of power and the feeling that it gives you the strength, is not, it's just not worth it. In the end, it doesn't lead to anything else. It's just like playing a video game, and then once you're through, what's next? You wasted time. But with knowledge, this is never the case. You cannot reach the boundaries of knowledge, and you cannot never know enough. And because that is the case, it is the only thing worth pursuing. Well, difficult to tell those people in Sudan right now, and in many other areas of the world as well. It is, in fact, difficult in general to properly explain it and understand this whole concept and the direction that I'm going with and the idea of DEVLETism. And this is why I always recommend you this book, because these ideas are, all explained here. And I do think that it has the power. No, I'm just kidding, but I think it has the potential to be quite useful also in your individual lives. So, highly recommended. This is going to be the last recommending sentence that I'm going to bother you with today. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As I said, there are so many thoughts, there are so many details to all this that I'm going to definitely pick it up at some point again. But until then, again, thank you very much for listening. Have a good one, and bye.